Good evening. I'm Dr. Jacqueline Hudson, the African American History Program Manager at the Filson Historical Society. Thank you for joining us for tonight's program. Clara Bingham is an award-winning journalist and the author of Witness to the Revolution, Women on the Hill, and the co-writer of Class Action. A former Washington, D.C. correspondent for Newsweek, her writing has appeared in Vanity Fair, The Guardian, The Daily Beast, among others. Please join me in welcoming Clara Bingham.
Hello, thank you so much, Jackie. And thank you to my amazing Louisville family who hosted the wonderful reception before. I'm so honored to be here. I was born in Louisville, but moved away to New York when I was 5. So I always come back whenever I can, and it is my home away from home. I love being here and being at the Filson. This is the first time I've been into the new edition, which is just so beautiful. So thank you all for coming, and I'm going to tell you all about my book. It is essentially a sequel to my last book, which was a oral history of the last school year of the 60s, and it was called Witness to the Revolution. And I interviewed about 100 people who were involved in all the different movements for social change. Some of them are in this room. And I had one chapter on feminism. And these women who I interviewed were amazing. They'd mostly come out of the Vietnam anti-war movement, and they were radicals, and they were frustrated by how the men in the movement had been treating them, and they wanted more leadership. And so they started the beginnings of the women's liberation movement. And after I finished that chapter, I realized this has to be my next book, because this is the revolution that lasted the longest and changed life for the most people, 50% of the population. So I managed, after Me Too, which was in 2017, my publisher finally agreed to let me do a book on feminism, because I was told before that they don't sell, apps don't even think about it. And I embarked on an amazing journey of interviewing 120 women whose ages ranged between 75 and 95. And I felt like this was so important to get their stories before they were lost to history. And a lot of the women in the book too had already died, and I spent a lot of time in archives finding their oral histories and their memoirs. So the book is, like my last book, an oral history, and I felt like that made the most sense, particularly for this movement, because this movement was all about the personal is political. And as we know, it changed everything from the bedroom to the boardroom to the factory floor, and it changed people's lives very individually. So you will hear, and I'll read to you a bit from all of these different characters who had such amazing experiences. We will start with, I'm learning how to use this. Uh-oh. Sorry. Okay, we're going to switch over. Oh, here we go. Okay, let's hope this works. If this happens again, we're going to switch over. We're going to start with the 1950s. So post World War II. And there was a huge flood of money and prosperity, and white people went to the suburbs, and the military industrial complex, instead of making bombs, started making washing machines, and the madmen on Madison Avenue developed a whole, incredibly powerful campaign idolizing domesticity. And in the 1950s, about 60% of women dropped out of college to have children. The average age of women having children was 20. And so after the 50s, women really saw as sort of backslide. And the only jobs you could get for women at that time, besides being a domestic, were secretary, nurse, and hold on. clerk, typist, and men had their own, okay, I'm switching over. Oh, got it. Men had their own help wanted areas. And in fact, I discovered later that the Newspaper Association, which my grandfather was a member of, fought having to desegregate the help wanted ads because they made so much more money having to double up. So that's a little embarrassing, but the just to give you a sense of how important the patriarchy was, United Airlines had their own flight for men only that ran from 1953 until 1970. And it was called the Chicago Executive. And it went from Chicago to New York, and women could not get a reservation on that flight. Oh, gosh. Okay, I'm okay, here we go. Sorry about this, everybody. Okay, here we go. Let's see how this works. How's this working? Okay, so to do that, okay, great. But one of the most glamorous jobs at the time was to be a flight attendant. And as you can see, they got to wear really sexy outfits and were required to leave the job once they were 31 years old. And they had to have their weight checked every day before they got on the flight. And if they were fired, if they got engaged, or God forbid, pregnant. So this was actually one of the great glamour jobs of the time, but also such an example of where we were in terms of women's work abilities and value. Enter Betty Friedan. And Betty was a freelance journalist. She was also a housewife and mother who lived in Westchester. And she she conducted a poll on her 15th reunion from Smith College. She was class of 1942, so just after the war had ended. And she ran around and talked to all of her highly intelligent classmates who were all miserable. And they, of course, were overeducated for the jobs they were doing, which was they were all privileged white women working at home. And I mean, as housewives and taking care of their children and having as many children as possible. And many of them were unsatisfied. The problem that had no name, which is what Betty called it when she published her blockbusting book. I didn't say ball busting, I meant blockbuster. The Feminine Mystique, which came out in 1963, sold 3 million copies and was an absolute phenomenon. It caught on, but for white women only, because here we were in the middle of the height of the civil rights movement. And the only way these suburban women would be able to have professional jobs is if someone took care of their children and cleaned their house, which Betty didn't really consider in this book. So it was very one-sided, but it definitely, for what it was, it made a huge impact on the culture. The other very important thing that happened the next year, 1964, was the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which was a sweeping bill which LBJ managed to get through Congress, and it ended Jim Crow in the South, among many other things, including voting rights and discrimination in the in employment. Which was, terrible in terms of race. It was also terrible for women, as I was just telling you. And at the very last minute, this gentleman in the middle, Howard Smith, who was from Virginia and was very much against the bill, he was a segregationist, added one word to Title VII, which was the employment part of the Civil Rights Bill. That word was sex. And it meant that you couldn't discriminate on the basis of race or sex. And he did this because he wanted to scuttle the bill. He wanted the bill not to pass. And a lot of there were a sort of group of women, one of them, Martha Griffiths, who was on right here, who was a congresswoman from Michigan, was a lawyer, and she wanted sex added to all of the titles of the Civil Rights Act, but realized that Howard Smith, who was chairman of the Rules Committee, had more power, and that she would just go with him, and it passed. He, of course, voted against the Civil Rights Act, but it was a bit of a fluke, and it was the most important legislative advancement for women's rights since the vote in 1920. And what it did was it created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And in 1965, and a third of the complaints that came to them in the first year were from women, which completely shocked all of the commissioners who had expected it all to be just about race. But the EEOC didn't deal very well with these complaints. It was all new. No one knew what to do. And lo and behold, this brilliant civil rights lawyer, Pauli Murray, who knew she was also behind adding sex to the Civil Rights Act and worked behind the scenes, understood the power of sexism as well as racism, and how important those two, working to solve those two problems at the same time was. She had gone to Howard Law School, and she was in the class of 1944, one of two women. She graduated first in her class. And this is what she said about her experience there. I became aware of sex prejudice in my freshman year at Howard Law School in 1941. It came upon me as a terrible shock. I had not been in school, I guess, for 2 or 3 days, and Professor Robert Ming said, "We don't know why women come to law school anyway, but since you're here." So what I'm really saying is that removing the racial factor, Howard University being a school where the racial factor was not the problem, immediately the sex factor was isolated. So my whole experience at law school was an experience of learning really for the first time what a crude kind of sexism can be, an unvarnished one. And so this is the beginning of my conscious feminism, which began at Howard University back in the 1940s. So Murray was about 20 years ahead of Betty Friedan. But the two of them teamed up and started NOW, the National Organization for Women, which was Murray's idea because she realized that women needed the equivalent of the NAACP. They needed a legal arm who could fight and take all of these discrimination cases to court the way the NAACP had been doing. And in 1966, in October, NOW had their founding meeting with their 28 members. You can see Pauli Murray in the back with the glasses. And there's Betty Friedan over on the far right. And this was the next major moment for women at the time. Also in 1966, the first woman ran the Boston Marathon. Her name is Bobby Gibb, and she was a natural runner and loved running and lived in Boston, had seen the marathon and had learned that women were not allowed to run in the marathon. Doctors told women at the time that if they ran long distances, their uterus would fall out. Very dangerous, not to mention unladylike. But Bobby, who had already been running long distances and had no trouble with her uterus, realized that this was a risk worth taking. So she jumped out of a bush at the starting line. And you can tell she trained in nurse shoes because there were no running shoes for women. And in this picture, she's wearing a leotard because, of course, there were no athletic bras for women. And she's wearing her brother's athletic shorts. And at the beginning, she wore a hoodie in hopes that no one would be able to tell her gender. And halfway through, it got too hot. So she took off her hoodie. And then the crescendo for her was when she got to Wellesley, which is a very important part of the marathon. This is what she told me when I interviewed her. Then I get to Wellesley. Well, the women at Wellesley College knew I was coming because it was on the radio. So they were waiting for me. I could hear these women screaming up ahead of me. When I got closer and they saw there was a woman running, they just went crazy. They were crying and leaping into the air and screaming. And one woman was going, Ave Maria, Ave Maria. I really felt at that moment that the world would never be the same again. It was like a pivotal moment where people saw things in a different way. Once the consciousness is changed in one person, then 2 people, then 10 people, then 1 million people, it becomes a social movement. And then you can get the laws changed, and then you can get the social system changed, and so forth. But it has to start with that change of consciousness. This is how the local papers described her. She was married at the time, hub bride. It went all over the world. This was a major headline. And if any of you haven't seen it, there's a wonderful documentary that my Aunt Eleanor here produced called Boston, which is about this amazing marathon, which, by the way, did not allow women until 1974. And this was the only marathon at the time. There were no other ones. And the Olympics didn't allow women in the marathon until 1984, which is quite shocking. I interviewed Bobby Gibb back in October of 2019 in Rockport, Mass. She is an artist who makes these amazing sculptures. And it was just incredible to actually be with her. And she was so articulate about how the personal is political that I felt she kind of became the poster child in a way of this book. It would take another 2 to 4 years for this movement to start catching on and snowballing. And this here is Robin Morgan, who I interviewed in her apartment in the West Village. And she was part of the group of civil rights activists and then anti-war Vietnam war activists who became frustrated by her comrades in arms. And she told me at the time, all the men want us to do is pour their coffee and roll their joints. She then joined up with a radical group of women in New York called New York Radical Women. They were one of the first women's liberation groups. So these were much younger women than the now women that we saw in that previous picture. Their politics were much more radical, and they brought a new energy to the movement that was very important and also became controversial, and there was a lot of conflict. But what they did was call themselves, instead of feminists, they called themselves Women's Liberation. And they decided to stage the first women's liberation protest ever in 1968 at the Miss America pageant in Atlantic City, New Jersey. And Robin Morgan was a former child actor, and she was also a yippie. And so she'd spent a lot of time doing street theater, and she understood the power of street theater in terms of getting media attention. So this is another thing she said to me. There's something contagious about demanding freedom, especially where women who comprise the oldest oppressed group on the face of the planet are concerned. So this protest hit the airwaves and made an enormous impact in terms of getting the word out about this movement, because there were women all over the country who were beginning to feel the same thing. They were beginning to start consciousness raising meetings and leaving their men in SDS and different groups they were a part of. And This is what Robin Morgan told me the impact of the protest had. The pageant has been called the birth of the women's movement, which is A, totally untrue, now was already toiling away, and B, deeply satisfied. If it was the birth date, conception and gestation had been going on for a long time, years of meetings, consciousness raising, thought, and plain old organizing had taken place before any of us set foot on the boardwalk. But this protest caught the public imagination, and other women learned that we existed. The week before the demonstration, there were about 30 women in the New York Radical Women meeting. The week after, there were approximately 150. Here they are, the cattle auction. There were a lot of people who booed at them, and they had to really deal with negativity. As you can see, this gentleman here is not very happy with it. One of the women who read the press coverage about the protest was Frances Beale. In 1969, she and her Black Women's Liberation Committee at SNCC, which was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, wrote a now famous manifesto, Double Jeopardy, to be Black and female, which I credit with the start of what we now call intersectionality. Beale was 81 in the summer of 2021 when I tracked her down in her senior living center in Oakland, California. And she was the perfect person to interview because she wasn't very mobile, but she had all her marbles. So I had her just where I wanted her. And she loved talking about this great moment in 69 and 70. And this is what she told me. As women got together and began talking about their role in the society and their role within SNCC, some of us began to see it wasn't an individual problem, but a social problem. The other thing that happened at the time was that some of the young men were attracted to the Nation of Islam perspective and the Congress of African People. Leroy Jones, who later became Amiri Baraka, talked about how abortion was genocide. We felt we needed to take a stand against these guys. I had gone to high school with a woman named Cordelia. When she was a freshman in college, she went to have an abortion and she died from the abortion. So here I was, 18 years old, and someone as young as that died because she didn't have access to a doctor. So I did not go along with this thing that abortion should not be a choice that Black women had. Frances Beale also told me about her abortion. I had my first abortion when I was 17. I was still in high school. My boyfriend and later husband, Jimmy, arranged it. It was a backstreet abortion on the kitchen table. I was horrified because I started bleeding and I was bleeding. And so Jimmy had enough sense to take me to the hospital. We bought a ring and pretended we were married. And they wanted to know, are you married? You should tell us. Did you do anything? You need to tell us if you did anything. We need to know. Jimmy had told me, no matter what they say, don't admit that you had an abortion. It was completely illegal. They could put me in jail. I was put in a ward with a lot of other women who had gone through grim, botched abortions. Some of them were yelling. I remember doctors saying to one of the young girls, easier going up than coming out, huh? That was one of dozens and dozens of war stories I heard from almost every single person I interviewed. Many of them had had more than one illegal abortion, and that was because by the late 60s, mid to late 60s, a perfect storm had happened, which was the sexual revolution. And so people were having sex before marriage in much larger numbers, but they did not have access to reliable birth control because birth control wasn't legal nationally until 1972 for people who were not married. And it wasn't even legal nationally for married people until 1965. So there was a nightmare going on in all of these urban hospitals. And Cook County Hospital in Chicago had a abortion ward for people like Fran Beal, and they had 100 women a week coming through that abortion. 1 million women had illegal abortions every year in America at that time, and at least 1,000 died. So that is what we were dealing with then. In Chicago in 1968, a feminist and former civil rights worker as well, named Heather Booth, was a student at the University of Chicago, and she got a call from a friend of hers whose girlfriend was pregnant, and they were desperate and asked for Heather's help. And she said she knew a doctor who was a civil rights doctor who might help them. He performed a safe abortion, and then her phone kept on ringing, and it was her payphone in her college dorm. So she told everyone who called, just ask for Jane. That was what became the code name for a much larger organization that Heather Booth started with her Women's Liberation Group in Chicago, which was a very, very active early part of the movement. They got together and they had a secret underground movement. Women were coming from all over the Midwest, knowing they could have safe abortions, and they would find doctors who would work for not too much money and who they could rely on, except for the doctor they ended up relying on the most. They discovered by the late 60s, early 70s, that he wasn't an MD. In fact, he'd been trained by the mafia, because the mafia had a whole abortion racket. And so they realized, well, if he's not an MD, then maybe we can do this too. So they started apprenticing with him, and he disappeared, probably worried that the mafia wanted their kickbacks. And they took his place, reduced the price of abortions, and 12 of them started performing abortions themselves. And they were performing 100 abortions a week. And over the time of Jane, from 1968 to 1972, women performed 11,000 abortions. Luckily, all of them safe. No one died, thank God. Until they did, of course, get busted by the police by 1972. And were lucky enough not to go to jail they were expected to go to jail for at least 10 years. But then Roe v. Wade passed a year later. So they survived. Laura Kaplan, one of the Janes, told me there was a real sense that we were empowering ourselves to do something out of the box, and we were creating the circumstances where the women who came to us could empower themselves by making decisions about what kind of life they wanted to lead, and they could take action to make that happen. So in the late 60s, as I mentioned, there weren't a lot of white collar job options for women, and Newsweek is a magazine where I actually went to work later, which was one of the great places for women to work. And a lot of Seven Sisters, college brilliant women went to work there. And I interviewed Lynn Povich, who was one of them. She felt very lucky to get her job. I graduated from Vassar in 1965, and the job listings were segregated. So it was help wanted male, help wanted female. And female jobs were nurse, teacher, secretary, or training program at Bloomingdale's. Less than 5% of women graduates until 1970 went to either medical school or law school, and 3% went to business school. We were post-war women raised in that culture of yes, you'll go to college, yes, you'll get married, and yes, you'll raise a family. You may have a job, but not a career. The word career was never mentioned. That's what we thought. It wasn't just that the men thought that way, the women thought that way too, with certain exemptions. There were always women who knew that this was unjust and unfair, and they were angry about it. But most of us were just happy to have a job at a really great place. Also working at Newsweek at the time was Nora Ephron, the late great Nora Ephron. This is what she said. Unfortunately, she died. I couldn't interview her, but she wrote a wonderful piece about Newsweek where she said, there were no male boys at Newsweek, only male girls. If you were a college graduate like me, who had worked on your college newspaper like me, and you were a girl like me, they hired you as a male girl. If you were a boy, unlike me, which with exactly the same qualifications, they hired you as a reporter and sent you to a bureau somewhere in America. Enter Eleanor Holmes Norton. Eleanor Holmes Norton had gone to Yale Law School. She had gone to Mississippi in 1964, and where she famously helped Fannie Lou Hamer get out of jail. That time that Fannie Lou Hamer was brutally beaten. And she had spent, the most of the 60s working in the South. Then she moved to New York and worked at the ACLU, where some of the Newsweek women came and met with her. This is what she told me. She's now is on the Hill and is the Congresswoman for DC. I was assistant legal director at the ACLU in New York. Newsweek at the time was hiring the best women and employing them as researchers. They were hiring the men as reporters and writers. It was one of those extraordinary cases a civil rights lawyer yearns for. It was a two-track system, one for women and one for men. But saying that is one thing. When there had not been many lawsuits of the kind brought. In fact, I don't know if any at that time, certainly not involving an entire group of women at a great corporation. This was a very important case because it was as blatant as black and white cases where blacks experienced different treatment from whites. So I met with the women, and though they tended to understand that there was discrimination going on, why else would they have come to the ACLU? They were very hesitant about moving forward. They feared retribution. So the first thing I had to do was to involve them not only in the legal matter, but in raising their consciousness as women. This was a path-breaking case, and they could not be punished because the statute had an element against retaliation. 46 women signed up for this class action, and they decided to announce it, suing Newsweek and their owner, Kay Graham, who was a woman, of course, but it was not hip to feminism yet at the time. She would get there later. They sued them the day that Newsweek published their first cover story on feminism in March of 1970. And of course, ironically, there were no writers at Newsweek who were women. So they had to hire someone from outside to write the story, but they smartly knew that it would hurt Newsweek publicly if they announced this. I interviewed Lynn Povich and Lucy Howard for this chapter of the book, and it wasn't until I interviewed them that I really learned about this lawsuit. And I'd gone to work at Newsweek in 1989. I was a few years out of college. I went to the Washington Bureau and became a White House reporter and was clueless about why I actually was there. I did not know about this case, and I'm so embarrassed that I didn't. And I was filing stories regularly to Lucy Howard, who I then interviewed about this. So it only confirmed why I thought it was important to write this book, because even knuckleheads like me did not know enough about why I, had the privilege to have a job like that. A few months later, on August 26th of 1970, which was the 50th anniversary of suffrage, Betty Friedan called for a nationwide women's strike for equality. Strikes were organized all over the country, in cities all over the country. And in New York, it was massive. They had no idea how many women would turn up, and over 50,000 did. They took over all of Fifth Avenue, and this was the banner they held: Women of the World Unite. In the front were old 80-year-old suffragists who walked up with Betty Friedan, and it turned out to be very diverse. And there were groups, there were housewives, there were women who supported Angela Davis, who at the time was a fugitive. There were women from all over and every different part of the movement. And it was a moment when the movement went mainstream. This is what Ivy Bottini, who at the time was the president of NOW in New York, said. I was exultant and deeply moved, especially when I stepped off the street and stood up on tippy toes on the sidewalks as the march turned a quarter to head for the rallying point. Stretched in front of me and behind me, filling the streets in all directions, from the sidewalk to sidewalk, were marchers who had joined our cause. I was almost brought to tears. The anti-Vietnam War and civil rights movement were important, but this, I thought to myself, was the real revolution. We were changing people's lives everywhere. Massive press coverage, and this is, I call this the moment when the movement went viral. Also in 1970, a big year, in College Park, Maryland, a woman named Bernice Sandler had just gotten her PhD in psychology and applied for 7 faculty jobs that were open at the university. And she was denied all of those jobs and told that she spoke out too much and was not ladylike enough. Her husband, she of course beat herself up, thought this was, she was a bad person and had not played the game right. Her husband said, no, this is discrimination. You need to look into this. So this is what she said. She told an interviewer, unfortunately, she died in 2019, so I just missed her. I had always wanted to be a professor. I was in the Department of Counseling and Personnel Services and taught some courses while I got my doctoral degree. The year I got my doctoral degree, 1969, at the University of Maryland, there was a huge expansion in the department, 7 openings, and they didn't even consider me. Meanwhile, 6 or 7 men got their doctorates at the same time as me, and all of them got job offers. I couldn't understand this. I went to one of the guys on the faculty whom I knew fairly well, and I said, hey, how come they didn't even think of me? And he was very frank. He said, well, let's face it, Bunny, that was her nickname, you come on too strong for a woman. So I started reading, and because there wasn't anything about women, discrimination against women, I started reading up on what the Blacks had done in terms of civil rights, and I quickly learned that sex discrimination was not illegal. I read a booklet from the Commission on Civil Rights, which was evaluating enforcement of various laws. Then I found a footnote about an executive order that President Johnson initiated, and it said something like this. This order covers contractors with the government, and it prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, and national origin. And then there was a footnote, and being an academic, I always read footnotes. I read the footnote at the back of the book, and it said, this executive order was amended in 1968 to add sex. I literally screamed aloud in the House. In 1970, women constituted only 9% of all full professors. Sandler took this little detail and ran with it. She became a natural organizer. By 1971, she had filed sex discrimination complaints against 350 colleges and universities who accepted federal money. She then ganged up with Edith Green, who was a congresswoman from Oregon on the Education Committee, a former teacher. And Edith was not exactly a radical feminist, as you can see here, but she was very strong on the issue of women's discrimination in education, which she had been watching for years. The two of them together wrote Title IX, which was a part of the overall education bill. And it was just a 37-word sentence that said, no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from the participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education platform or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Activity, which was added, that one word was added in, and Edith Green knew what that meant, which is it would cover sports. But she didn't want any women to lobby for this bill. And she got it through the House quietly. Birch Bayh took it up in the Senate. And this is what Billie Jean King told me about Title IX. Without the word activity in those 37 words of Title IX, we wouldn't have women's sports. Senator Birch Bayh told me that they debated whether to leave it in or take it out, and they went back and forth on it. And I remember him telling me, I'm so happy we left it in, because we would not have any understanding of what it was going to do for women. He said, I really didn't know it was going to do this great job. So not only were women then allowed into the professional graduate schools and given professor jobs, allowed into academia, essentially, which they'd really been, pushed out of, but they were allowed to do sports and get scholarships for sports and teams for sports. And today, over $200 million is spent on women's athletic scholarships. So this made education available. I interviewed Donna de Verona, who had won a gold medal at the Olympics in 60 and in 64. And when she went to college in California, she had to do side jobs because she couldn't afford it. All the men on the swim team, of course, had scholarships. Same with Billie Jean King. So they got to college, but they were on their own. There were no teams for them to participate in, and they had to do everything on the side. 1972, Gloria Steinem, who you can see sitting down, Letty Cotton Pogerman is the blonde with the wacky glasses behind her, and a group of other women journalists who were frustrated with the white male mainstream media started their own magazine called Ms. This was the first issue. It came out in January of 1972. This cover story was called The Click Moment, which was something that people talked about at the time when women would suddenly have a click moment and realize that they were going to change their lives. And the woman who wrote this article, who I also interviewed, described her click moment, which is in the piece. She said she was on holiday in Fire Island with a few other families, and the women had made dinner, breakfast, and lunch, and they were just cleaning up the kitchen when one of the husbands came into the kitchen and said, hey, what's for dinner? And that was her click moment. Everyone else had one too. But what this first issue was famous for was a centerfold article called We Have Had Abortions. And in it, 53 women, most of them prominent and well-known, admitted in a very brave way that they had abortions. It was 72, so it was still illegal nationally. And Billie Jean King was one of them. So when I was writing about Billie Jean King, I discovered that she was attacked viciously by the press when this came out because they accused her of just having an abortion so she could make more money. So late one February night in 2022, I was writing this chapter and I thought I should really print out the PDF and see who else is on this list. I knew that Nora Ephron had put her name on, but I wasn't sure who else. I went down alphabetically. The first name is Eve Auchincloss, followed by Sunny Aurelio, followed by Lorraine Beebe, followed by Joan Bingham, my mother. My mother had died a year before, so I never got to ask her what it meant for her to add her name to this list. I don't know if it was embarrassing that maybe her in-laws here in Louisville might have seen it, or if it was something she didn't care about because she never told me. I'm assuming maybe she forgot. Before she died, she knew I was working on this book. And I did know that she had had an abortion. She'd flown to London, which was something that privileged women did at the time. But I never stupidly asked her any details about it. Of course, all the 100 women I interviewed, I knew every detail about their abortions. And I hadn't even asked my mother because it felt sort of taboo, and I wasn't in this mindset of being curious about it. But that was a moment when, sort of like the Newsweek moment, when this history came up and sort of grabbed me by the ankles and reminded me that this had been, made a big impact on my life as well. I was very proud of her. She wasn't much of a movement feminist, so I was surprised that she put her name on the list. Also in 1972, the first Black woman congresswoman from Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, Shirley Chisholm, who is seated here. These are her staff members, who she called the Chisettes. She only hired women. She felt very strongly that it should be multiracial, and she was all about the rainbow. And then in 1972, she just decided she was going to run for president, which shocked everybody. The Congressional Black Caucus did not endorse her, nor did the National Women's Political Caucus, which she'd helped found. They didn't endorse her either, but she felt really strongly that there was a new generation of young people out there who needed a voice, and they did not feel represented by the 5 white male Democrats, George Wallace being one of them, Scoop Jackson, who were running in this primary. And she ran it on a shoestring, talked to college students all over the country who would this was the first election where you could vote at age 18. And she also was very anti-war. She was very pro-gay rights. She was incredibly progressive. And she knew she couldn't win, but she understood that she was representing something that was more important than winning. Here she is with a huge crowd. She raised a total of $300,000, but ran the entire primary, which was amazing. And she got to Miami, where the convention was, and with 2.7% of the general vote, she was on the ballot in 14 states, and she gathered 152 delegates. She also inspired a young woman named Barbara Lee, who was at Mills College. She was a welfare mother of 2. She was head of the Black Student Union. She invited Shirley Chisholm to come speak to them. Mills was in the Bay Area. And she realized, oh, I need to work for her. And Shirley Chisholm said, but you have to register to vote. And of course, Barbara Lee said, no, why would I register to vote? No one represents me in this government. And Shirley Chisholm said, if you register to vote, you can work for me. So she helped gather votes for Shirley Chisholm in Oakland, and later was the congresswoman from Oakland for 13 terms. So she was an example of the power that Shirley Chisholm had. When Shirley got to give her final speech at the convention, this is what she said about it. When I got to the convention hall, it was lit up by noise. That was a wonderful moment for me to see the way all of the delegates received me at the convention, because I had felt that someday a Black person or a female person should run for the presidency of the United States. And now I was a catalyst for change. So let's hope that let's hope Shirley's dream will come true. Any questions? Keith. There's a Oh, no, it's not a long comment, is it?
In the summer of
It's working, it's good.
in the summer of 1972, which was so important in the year of the women's movement, your uncle authorized Carol Sutton, who was the women's editor of the Courier Journal, to hire the first male reporter on her staff and one of the first male women's department staffers in America. And he's standing here before you right now.
Oh, my God.
And it was truly the most exciting assignment of my career, which had many assignments that were interesting. But those were such yeasty, exciting times. It was the year of Roe v. Wade. It was the year of Shirley Chisholm's candidacy and the founding of Ms. Magazine. And I worked with so many dynamic women, many of whom became plaintiffs in a suit against the Courier Journal.
Oh.
That was modeled after the Newsweek suit and was settled in 1978. And my final comment in this long statement is that I was hired as a reporter at the salary level of a woman. And not until about 1980 did I get a bump in my weekly check, biweekly check, because the suit had been settled and it was determined that I was one of the people who had been penalized along with all those women, and my salary had stayed behind
Wow.
even after I went on the editorial board. So,
Oh, my gosh.
So anyway, the women's movement affected many of us, but we're
Especially
so-
you.
We're so grateful to you for telling this story. Thank you, Claire.
Oh, thanks for sharing that, too. I'm sorry it took so long for them to settle that case.
I wanted to know if you interviewed people, women out in the country, because in 1973, I started a NOW chapter in Paducah, Kentucky.
Amazing.
Yeah, so did you talk to people
Well-
out in the, and that would be considered rural? right?
Yes, yeah. I should have interviewed you, first of all. I confess that I talked to more people from urban areas, Washington, Boston, New York, Chicago, LA, and San Francisco, which is not fair because the movement was absolutely widespread and now had thousands of chapters at that time. And it was just harder for me to find everybody. And what I did write about is near the end of the book, two women went all over the country and wrote this amazing catalog, which was, it was modeled after the Whole Earth catalog. And they interviewed people all over, women all over, they drove across country and they found women's communes and mechanic shops and printing presses and publishing companies and bakeries and restaurants that by 1973, the movement was so enormous and had also taken place in so many different parts of American life. And they were able to chronicle that. So I interviewed them, but that is definitely a failing of the book. I'm sorry to say. Any other questions?
I love Paducah. How do you suggest we explain to young men that this is their history too?
Very important. This is everybody's history, of course. And I think I have two young sons who are in their late 20s, and I'm encouraging them to read the book and their friends. The audiobook is a little more popular with their generation, but it's so important for them to understand what their privilege used to be, and how, because now they're facing, a lot of backlash, and it's hard for some white men to get jobs these days, and it's hard for them to know why, but the second you see the ad for the executive, it helps them understand where white men used to be and why it's time to share. So I just think it's, of course, and of course, the issue of abortion and reproductive rights is not just a women's issue at all. So it's important for young men to know what their privilege is, where it comes from. Anyone else?
This is the converse, but I'll start with, I have twin sisters who were born in 41, have as many horror stories as anybody else. They both persevered and kicked ass and made a lot of money. So I was enlightened by the time I was 18 with what women could do. Throughout my life, I've run into women who say, oh, but I'm a woman. I don't have to work as hard as you. I get a privilege that you don't.
Wow.
I've gotten in trouble because I get followed up. You can't say that at 2000. And
Yeah, women can be sexist too. Yeah, we know it. Well, I think you have to do all the work.
Like, no.
Huh?
It's a frustrating part.
Yeah, well, that is hard. And the fact is, women are 50% of the population, so they come in all stripes. Really do. So that's very interesting. Yes, yes, and well, thank you for holding the flag.
Right, we've got time for one more before we need to wrap.
First, thank you for the work you do. This is a labor of love, and it is an amazing legacy. I'm wondering, gender is now becoming the #1 indicator for your potential vote. It used to be socioeconomics, then it was education, then it was race. Gender is now probably the #1 predictability factor when determining whether you're going to vote for, in this case, Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. What are your thoughts about how you see this divide either hurting or helping the country as women are coming into their own, but it's also isolating women, I think politically and culturally in some cases?
Well, it's definitely, this is supposed to be the biggest gender gap ever in any presidential election. And especially with Gen Z, where the gap is the very largest. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. One of them is social media and what young men are getting fed on the algorithm, which is very right-wing, from what I hear, much more right-wing than what women are being fed. We have a woman who works for Emerge right there, who would probably be able to answer this question better than I can. But I do think, all I can say is I think that this is the first time in 50 years that women have radically lost their rights. And it is an existential human rights issue. This is not just a issue, and so it is so profound. It's affecting 1/3 of the women of childbearing age in America. There are 20 banned states right now. And so I think it has galvanized women to get out and vote and to organize and to give money. And I mean, just to look at the enthusiasm that happened after Biden dropped out finally, and the enthusiasm for Kamala Harris among especially women was just amazing. So I think it is really to be celebrated. I think the gender gap is more a positive thing about women coming out to vote and caring about women's rights, more so than isolation. And what's sad about it is that there aren't more men coming with them. And that's, I think, quite scary, actually. But thank you all for coming.